Black Lives Matter Strategies for the Struggle Part 2. For many of you, this is a second addition to a conversation that we had last December, where we were able to engage students here at Chicago Theological Seminary about where we are at such a Kairos moment with the Black Lives Matter movement, and what are our future potential and possibilities as we move forward. Today's panel is an attempt to bring religious leaders and activists from outside of the Chicago Theological Seminary who are doing definite grassroots efforts and engaged in ways that can help us think about our sacred convictions as well as positionalities in the Black Lives Matter movement moving forward. So tonight we have, and hopefully more students will trickle in, feel free to grab some dinner even as we have our conversation, because we want it to be an intimate discussion between all of us. But we have Quincy James Reinhardt, who is one of our PhD students here at Chicago Theological Seminary, who will be our moderator guiding the questions for us today. And Quincy will introduce our panelists. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm going to introduce the Reverend Dr. Danielle Buhuru, CPE Supervisor, Department of Mission and Spiritual Care Advocate, South Suburban, and Advocate Trinity Hospitals. Dr. Buhuru serves as the Senior Pastor of Lincoln Memorial Congregational UCC. Her members say, quote, Reverend Danielle is committed to family, faith, and fairness. She is also a creative soul with a spirit of never-ending excitement. The Reverend Danielle is a graduate of Chicago Theological Seminary, where she earned her Master of Divinity and Doctor of Ministry in Religion and Healthcare. She currently works in clinical pastoral education supervision at Advocate Trinity and South Suburban Hospitals, and is a board-certified chaplain with the Association of Professional Chaplains. Welcome back home.
Thank you.
And then we have the pastor and activist, Jedediah Brown, Chicago, Illinois, born at Little Company of Mary Hospital and raised in Southland, Chicago. Mr. Brown is a pastor's kid, raised in the church with his parents and siblings. As a young man, he was always a leader. At the age of 16, he was already working for his community before he understood what activism was. Brown founded a non-for-profit organization, Chosen Generation, as a junior in high school, which would later involve his church. Mr. Brown reconstructed the program, outreach, and community, and used the resources to serve over 100 at-risk youth in Robbins, Illinois. Today, he focuses his talents on bridging the gaps in generations and empowering people to be their own source of change. As an award-winning activist and pastor, he has mobilized over 10,000 people in an effort to bring change to his Chicago. Pastor Brown, or Jedediah, is a young man with a drive and a passion to change the world one life at a time. Would you do me a favor and put your hands together for our two guests? Again, welcome. Part one of the Black Lives Matter conversation was centered more around theory, the what of the matter. For this portion of the conversation, we want to address the praxis, the how of the matter. So Paula Giddings, in her critical text, Where and When I Enter, highlights the importance of Black women's voices in the struggle for justice, and also where Black women enter into conversations abroad. With that same motto and same framework, where and when do you enter the Black Lives Matter movement?
First, I want to first say thank you for the opportunity to come before you on this afternoon. I never entered this space without publicly acknowledging my elders, who I consider three professors here who have meant so much to me in my life, Reverend Dr. Joanne Terrell, Reverend Dr. Julius Speller, and Reverend Dr. Lee Butler. I thank them for all that they have meant to me in my life, both professionally and personally. To answer your question, first and foremost, I think that there needs to be some what I call psychological and emotional connectedness. My concern whenever we have conversations around Black Lives Matter and where are we in the struggle is I wonder if we even see ourselves as connected to the struggle. I'm always concerned about issues of class, first and foremost, and if we feel as if that's my brother laid out in the middle of the street, or is that my sister who's just been shot in the face on this porch by this gentleman in Michigan. And so I think the conversations first have to go into an area around connectedness, and do we see ourselves as a part of the struggle? I'm interested, as we talk about gender, I am interested in, along those lines, how do African American women see themselves as connected to the Black Lives Matter movement? I speak to several African American women who invoke class in this conversation around saying such comments as, well, if they would have just listened to the police, if they would have just stopped, if they would not have walked away, if Mike Brown wouldn't have just robbed that convenience store, if Trayvon Martin would have turned around and listened to George Zimmerman, even if Laquan McDonald hadn't been walking down the middle of the street wielding a knife. And so I'm always perplexed by those responses, and those responses are very telling around if you see this as that's their issue or is this our issue. I think that's where the conversation has to begin, issue of connectedness.
But what brought you specifically to the movement?
What brought me to the movement? A couple of concerns. One, I do have two 7-year-old sons, Ezekiel and Josiah. And always being concerned, I'm at a place of discerning. Is Chicago where I want to raise my two sons? I'm at a place of wondering, do I need to walk away from Advocate Healthcare? Do I need to walk away from Lincoln Memorial and relocate? Because I have two sons who in about 7 or 8 years are going to be some of the same ages as our brothers and sisters who have been killed. And so I'm affected by this personally. I'm also affected by this professionally, in that I can't tell you how many African American families come into hospitals, and I have to sit with doctors who lie, doctors who go out to mothers and fathers and say, we did everything we could, Mrs. Johnson, and we could not save your son. And me knowing that you just did chest compressions for 2 minutes and then you called it, right? I'm also connected to this issue professionally, in that my church, being geographically located in the Woodlawn neighborhood, where I am deeply disappointed at our alderman, who continues to make deals with the University of Chicago to increase University of Chicago public safety and the police force in the Woodlawn neighborhood outside of the Hyde Park boundaries. And these University of Chicago officers who are coming now into the Woodlawn neighborhood and going north into the Kenwood neighborhood, who are now have a contract with the Woodlawn and Kenwood neighborhood to make criminal arrests which means now you are seeing an influx in criminal arrests in these neighborhoods outside of Hyde Park, which has a severe impact. I myself am deeply impacted by this, as I have been pulled over several times on my way to church on Sunday mornings by a University of Chicago police officer. And the trauma of how that has impacted me and my family, the embarrassment of having to say to a police officer, if you look at that marquee, you'll see my name right there on that marquee. And so I'm also impacted in those ways as well.
Thank you. Pastor Brown, you do a lot socially and politically in the community. Tell us when and where you enter the Black Lives Matter movement, but also talk about this notion of Black death and how on a countless times you're called by families to identify Black bodies.
Well, I too want to thank you all for this amazing opportunity to sit before such esteemed individuals and next to this amazing doctor and activist and pastor here. And I think that everything that you spoke so eloquently on can segue right into what I've been asked, and I would love to just build upon it because I have the same heartbeat and sentiment of where she placed this. I am, or I would have been the statistic, the Black man that we often hear about, but we hear about on the side of needing. I grew up as a pastor's kid, and that was a challenge of its own because on top of being young and trying to figure out your own identity, you also have to watch your parents be in a position of always being needed by everyone else. And then rebelling against the notion of there being a God. And because of that and seeing my peers who not necessarily shared my faith live a different life, something that I was kind of sheltered from initially, but then once exposed to, I wanted all of that. I wanted the streets, I wanted the gangs. I didn't want to pay attention in school. And those put me in positions where I was on the receiving end of what I would call, or what I would say, the dark side of society is. And because of that, and because of my interactions with policemen and my interactions with my peers and my interactions with institutions, it put me in a position where I felt hopeless and I felt alone. And I felt like I had to fight every single thing while also trying to figure out my own identity. So, as even in the biography, before I knew what activism was, I kind of feel like I was put into a positioning where I had to get the foot off of my neck, so to say. And then having been spared from a lot of near-death experiences, I know the value of having God be a keeper of your life. But specifically to identify your question, my past prepared me for what I do. And because of who I am, and my passion for it, it allowed me to become visible in such that other individuals in my predicament that I identified, I basically went to their aid because I know their pain. I know their struggle. I'm connected to what they feel. And even in this time now, where I particularly live in South Shore, what made me become an quote-unquote anti-violence activist is the alarming number of young, dead, lifeless bodies that I've seen walking outside my own front door. And these families who are trying to figure out, number one, is this real? Number two, how could this possibly happen? They're looking for a resource or an answer. And I've generally showed up to these scenes because I understand the transitions and the processes And so now I've kind of sort of become one of the go-to people in our city when there is a death, unfortunately. And it's not something that I wanted to do. Someone said that being in this line of life is not something that you choose to do. It's something you can't help doing.
So the Black Lives Matter movement is responding to a national crisis. However, this national crisis is not a new one. Historically, the devaluing of black bodies, black existence, and black self-worth has always been a part of the larger meta-narrative within white American culture. From the slave trade, the assault of black women through raping, the assault of black men to continue the slave system by having them produce children, from Reconstruction to lynchings to the civil rights movements. This commercialization of black bodies is not, again, a new phenomenon. With that thought in mind, how has the Black Lives Matter movement been reimagined in light of the civil rights movement? And here I'm talking about leadership styles and hierarchical constructions that builds power.
One of the things that I love about the Black Lives Matter movement is it is not the civil rights movement. And I think we will be in trouble if we keep comparing the two. I believe that we need to stop this comparison of Black Lives Matter movement versus the civil rights movement, or criticizing the Black Lives movement for not being like the civil rights movement. I think we're talking about two very different time periods. One of the things that I love about the Black Lives Matter movement is there isn't one leader. There's no one defined leader, right? Civil rights movement is defined by Martin Luther King Jr. or SNCC. I love the Black Lives Matter movement because it is not defined by one particular person. I also love the Black Lives Matter movement because in some ways it is not sexy or seductive like the civil rights movement. One of the dynamics that I'm always challenged by, that I love, is the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement is in your face, it's authentic, it's honest, it's genuine, and it's people who are not afraid to roll up their sleeves and get dirty. One of my critiques of the civil rights movement is that whenever there was a protest, if you will, whenever there was a march, whenever there was a demonstration, it was so highly organized that sometimes it excluded people. In order to even march in the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King, persons were picked first, were trained first, and you had to pass certain psychological and emotional tests before Martin Luther King would allow you to march in the civil rights movement. And so what I love about Black Lives Matter movement is it's more inclusive of everyone. It's not exclusionary. I love the Black Lives Matter movement because it takes into consideration gender, it takes into consideration homophobia and sexual orientation in ways that your civil rights movement was very sexist, very homophobic. We still never acknowledge the benefits of Bernard Rustin, who talked to Martin Luther King, and a lot of Martin Luther King's speeches were based off of information that was given to him by Bernard Rustin. And so I appreciate the differences of this movement. It's more of an honest, authentic, and genuine movement. Also, I'm aware that the Black Lives Matter movement is made up of people in a different socioeconomic status from those in the civil rights era. Most of the time, your persons in the civil rights movement were working professionals, middle, upper class persons. But what I love about the Black Lives Matter movement is it involves people who are under certain economic constraints. It involves persons who may be unemployed. It involves persons who look different, dress different, act different, talk different in some respects. And so I do not think that you can compare the two or ask the Black Lives Matter movement to be like the civil rights movement.
But we will agree that it is a continuation of, right, this, it's a continuum of the civil rights movement.
I don't believe that, no.
Okay, let's talk about this.
I believe there are vast differences. There are vast differences. The civil rights movement, in some sense, at the forefront, my belief, is that people were asking for permission to sit at the table. What I love about the Black Lives Matter movement is brothers and sisters want to dismantle the table altogether and start a brand new paradigm. Nobody is asking for permission to sit at this holy Mecca table. However, people are saying we need to do away with this table altogether and start a brand new paradigm. And so, no, I do not see them as both connected. And I think that's some of the challenges with our elders from the civil rights movement, not really understanding their place, not really understanding how they can be fully involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. I love my brother Jesse Jackson, but my brother Jesse Jackson is not connected to the Black Lives Matter movement.
Now, Pastor, you are out with the politicians. You are in the police officers' faces. You are holding chains. You are chaining doors. Talk about that in light of the question around leadership roles within the Black Lives Matter movement.
So I want to say that this is my perspective, and it is a truth. I mean, it is a truth, but may not necessarily be the full truth as it relates to things. I personally can't speak to the civil rights movement because the one thing that my generation didn't get was an inheritance. We don't know fully the impact of the civil rights movement. We don't know the structure. We don't know what the family's effect was then. We can't fully appreciate it. And so the first thing that I do want to say is I don't subscribe to the Black Lives Matter movement. I subscribe to righteousness. And the reason I subscribe to righteousness is because there is a righteous anger in me because of recognizing what God spared me from. It pushes me to never be complacent or to get comfortable watching other people miss out on what God is able to do. And because of that, what I've come to terms with is that the God that I serve doesn't change. He's the same God today that he was yesterday, that he'll be forever. And what that means is that the Black Lives Matter movement for me is just another sub-label for us to find further reasons to divide ourselves. There is no such thing as a disconnect of the civil rights movement and what's going on now. It has to be a continuation of it. But because you have individuals, my generation in particular, because we don't understand what was fault, we don't understand what we got. We're trying to recreate it. And therefore, we've kind of hit the reset button, and that's why you'll see, yes, the in-your-face personality. Yes, we want to destroy tables, but then we still have the reports of low voter turnout. We still have the reports of people not having economic opportunities. I get wanting to destroy the table, but you have to also look at the intricacies of that. This population of people that are in movement are people who don't feel value and don't feel like they have an advocate, and they don't feel like they have an example of what to become. So I would appreciate, I wish, or let me say this, and it's not it's just, like I said, it's my perspective. I would hate for Jesse Jackson to die, and I didn't draw out of him what he has, because I'm going to restart the altar from the altar that wasn't set before me. One thing that people in the Bible understood was to put before me what I came into so that I never forget. and dishonor what they had to get through. So you're dealing with a generation that are doped up on drugs, that don't feel value, they're in survival mode, and they want to tear everything up, but what they don't know how to do is build up anything, because as a black community, we haven't identified our identity. We don't know what leadership looks like. I'm talking about righteous leadership, because you want to be tried and proven. Everybody in the camera is not ready to lead our people to a good quality of life. And so what you don't see in the news is the infighting that happens amongst us young people, because we're trying to figure out who gonna lead this thing. But nobody wants to be made. Nobody wants to be proven. And I serve a God that is of decency and in order. He turned over tables when they dishonored what he established. He turned over tables when it mishandled what he stood for. But to turn over tables because I'm so disgruntled and upset and I'm lost, ultimately, I believe is going to contribute to us hitting the reset button and restarting. And I'll say it like this. We're looking at Donald Trump potentially becoming our next president. And I never thought in my life I would see the Ku Klux Klan come out boldly. I never thought that I would see that. I never thought that I would see a young black woman being pushed in a crowd of white individuals, expressing her freedom of speech, and it being okay with mainstream media. We are doing a good thing by bringing the next generation up and allowing them to be visible and to be seen. But if we don't impart the wisdom of what the generation before us had, my same generation is going to be the destruction, and it's going to be the reset button of what the civil rights movement accomplished.
So there are many different places I can go, but I want to press you on something. You talk about this idea of righteousness and righteous anger. I think it's King that talks about righteous indignation. Can you talk about what that looks like?
I've learned to infuse the two. So you talked about, I don't know if anybody's seen it on the news, but I took a chain and I went down to police headquarters to lock the door. Well, that's a fire hazard. I know that's the law. I'm going to jail. But what's in me doesn't want necessarily permission to do what I'm led to do. But I understand that I serve again, because for me it just goes back to God. I'm so glad y'all let me put my faith in this activism. I serve a God who is creative and who does things above what I could ever think or imagine. He just wants me to say yes when he give me the idea. And so when it relates to my righteous indignation, I look at the level of insult. I look at the disregard for the inhabitants of the city. I look for how no matter how much we've been marching, our people are still disconnected and asleep. We can throw an anti-violence event before we throw an event that empowers our young people. We want to tell them, we know you're getting shot, and these are the reasons you're getting shot, but then don't nobody come back and say, but you don't got to be like this, and here's some resources for you to not go down that path. So I've learned to break the mold, and my righteousness says that I cannot be comfortable being like everybody else. And I got to do something to serve notice that I'm going to meet you where you are. Because as I would say, the gates of hell will not prevail in this situation. And I'll break this whole nice clergy mode, and I'll pick up a chain and I'll lock your front door as a taxpaying citizen and say, on behalf of this city, this building is ineffective. And then that makes your elected officials respond. That's how I can call my elected officials and I can get an answer. That's how I can call business owners and get them to participate, because they understand that I'm so uncomfortable with complacency that I'm going to make them uncomfortable with oppression. Jesus and justice go hand in hand. Whenever he showed up, he gathered a multitude because he broke the mold of what was typical and ordinary. We don't serve an ordinary God, and we got to stop acting like ordinary people.
So Our beloved mother and ancestor, Audre Lorde, once stated that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. With that thought in mind, and given our political climate, what should the policy objectives and goals of the Black Lives Matter movement be?
I think the policies and goals of the Black Lives Matter movement should be first and foremost self-esteem, self-esteem and love. Self-esteem and love are huge for me. I don't necessarily believe in resources first. I think resources are important. I think you can give resources, but that won't speak to low self-esteem. That won't speak to shame. That won't speak to guilt. That won't speak to lack of love. I think that we create unnecessary anxiety. I think that we create unnecessary tension. I think that we create unnecessary strife by focusing on certain elements that we shouldn't focus on. You can give someone all of the resources in the world, but if they lack self-esteem and love, then they don't know how to use that resource. I am not afraid of this whole Donald Trump issue. And here's why I'm not afraid of it. If you research, you'll discover that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are actually good friends. If you read William Cooper, A Pale White Horse, Bill Cooper talks about how in politics, sometimes persons work out. I'm going to ask my friend to say something to get people wound up, to get folks anxious, so that then I can walk in and get this particular political seat. And so I'm not concerned. I'm not concerned. I don't fear that, Donald Trump is going to become president, because he's not. Him and Hillary are actually good friends, and he's running for the purpose for Hillary to get into office.
Agreed.
Because Hillary wouldn't be able to win against a Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio, right? She will win against a Donald Trump. And so I think that it's important to keep the issues clear here. I think it's important to not become overly anxious over things. I think at the core, when we talk about what should be on the agenda of the Black Lives Matter movement, I do believe that we are missing with self-esteem. We are missing that key component. I think self-esteem and love, I'm a Bell Hooks fan, is at the core of this all. I think that we have been brainwashed in a capitalistic society to believe that we need material possessions and resources in order to survive. I think we are missing what I call inner peace. We are missing an inner core that gives us sustainability and substance. And I think that that's a hard conversation to talk about. I think not everyone is ready to have a conversation around self-esteem and pride. I think that people act out of woundedness. I think people are acting out of pain. I think people are acting out of hurt from their own personal history. And so I am concerned with, before I preach Jesus, I am concerned about, do you have some psychological healing? Do you have some emotional healing? My sadness about these conversations is we take it all to Jesus and we take it all to the cross. And we put Jesus on everything. We put the Bible on everything. Meanwhile, this brother and sister really needs to be sitting down with a psychological therapist talking about some issues. And so I'm into how do we link mental health and mental stability with some of these issues? I was deeply saddened. When my little brother, Marshawn, commits suicide on the steps of the state capitol, right? Who's a Black Lives Matter leader, right? He commits suicide because of all of the psychological trauma that he has internalized from this movement. And so I believe that we need to speak more to psychology, personality, and human development. I love Dr. Lee Butler because he was the first person who painted this picture clear to me around you cannot have justice, you cannot have pastoral care, you cannot have religion, God talk, theology, any of that without first taking into consideration mental health and psychology. And so if anything, what does the Black Lives Matter movement need? Before righteousness, I would say peace of mind, wholeness in mind, before we begin to get into these other conversations.
Mm-hmm. This tension between the Black Lives Matter movement, the young people, and the older people, the pastors, many of whom are conservative and are not a part of the Black Lives Matter movement. They're not even social justice oriented. And so you have the mayor who kinds of tell these pastors to keep these young people in line. Talk about that tension that the younger people are having with the clergy, the pastors, the watchmen and women of the city.
So I want to, because we're having a dialogue, I want to also touch on the question that you asked a few minutes ago around policy. But I can summarize both with this one statement. Rules without relationship breeds rebellion. Rules without relationship breeds rebellion. As it relates to the shaping of policy and as it relates to tensions, you are speaking to a lot of people who know how to fight, but we have not focused or learned how to build. And the first thing that we haven't learned how to build is a sense of community and a sense of self. And when I say that, I'm only speaking from my perspective, and I just got to just be authentic to who I am. I didn't get to have the awesome opportunity to go into a university and get a PhD or get the education. Again, I'm in this from experience, and Jesus, in my understanding, he saved my life and he kept me. I don't worry about who everyone else subscribes to. I just remember that day when I took a bad drug and I was temporarily insane for 3 days, and they admitted me into the psych ward. It wasn't until they gave me or showed me this Bible and I saw the name Jesus, and me keep focusing on that name in this book, and all the other words became blurry and literally was running off of the page, and I just kept saying, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And the voice that was in my head saying, I'm going to lock you away forever. And I'm negotiating with my body. Stop rocking. Don't do that. Don't go there. Don't look like that. But I'm saying, and then I get this, and I kept saying, Jesus going to fix this. Jesus got me. And that being what brought me out of an insane state, you can't tell me that he ain't real. And what I believe is that a lot of people know the intellectual side of God, but they don't know the power of God. And that is when you don't put anything before your faith, because it's the anchor that makes everything else make sense. I got a relationship with God. And my grandmother, who also was uneducated, my grandfather, who was also uneducated, if they couldn't get me to the book, they had a prayer life. And it was something that I watched them struggle with in their life that gave me the tenacity and the fortitude that no matter what state I'm in or no matter what resource I'm in, I know that I got to call on God, and I believe that he can answer. So what's happening in our society, this disconnect between the activists and the clergy, is that there's no relationship because the churches have literally robbed society. And we've robbed society of the power of God. We've robbed society. We'll often use scriptures like how when the people came and laid all their possessions at the feet of the apostle. And we'll leave it at that. But we don't talk about what their response then was. They took all that increase and they turned and gave it back to everyone according to need. The church has become an event instead of an encounter. And because of that, our clergy have become complacent, and they sit at the king's table not as a conscious voice of what the moral standard is, but they're compromised because they're trying to eat with the king. Yeah. I'm just speaking conceptually. I hope I'm making sense to y'all. And because their voice is compromised, pastors and clergy don't genuinely demonstrate an authentic desire, a righteous desire, to engage these young people who don't have an example. And because of that, again, our anger and our frustration is now coming outward, and it is expressing itself as, we can't stand y'all. We don't have a relationship with y'all. And your God has failed us. Because how could your God let us be in this positioning? And then I can speak to the mayor, because it was all over national news, that one particular thing when the mayor called us all in the office when they was getting ready to release the Kwame McDonald video, and he said, if you guys don't ensure that there's peace, don't look to me to resources. And that really struck all the pastors really hard. And I saw something that I didn't understand until an hour or two of thinking about it. They spent majority of their conversation talking about how heinous this video was that was going to release, that showed about this young man who was going to be shot, who was shot 16 times. And that the video don't necessarily show the narrative that's been given, that this officer is still working, and there was no response from the pastors. They was just watching. But the moment they said, don't look to me for resources, now it's an uproar. Now this conversation is a problem. And in that moment, it validated something that I felt that we've seen all over society. The Bible says that we're the salt of the earth. If we lose our Savior, then shall it be salted. We preserve. We are so compromised, and we are so, we don't have a standard anymore. We want to shout. And we just want to get revelation and new knowledge and feel important. We want to have on the cape instead of the apron. So because of it, our leadership is more focused on what they can get out the room for themselves. And our young generation know it because the resources ain't reaching them. And now they have anger. Just as a kid who did not grow up with his father, I ask myself this every day, knowing what I know. Why is it okay for me that my father is alive, but I am not pressed to have a relationship with him? It is because in the few moments that I had with my dad, he had a lot of knowledge, but because it didn't manifest to wisdom that I can tangibly reach, he's invalidated to me. And I feel like I've had to do all this without him. I'll just figure the rest out. I never knew what it was to be a son, which handicaps me as it relates to trying to be a father. And these young generation never knew what it means to have an experience with God, so they're okay without him.
So,
Hope that makes sense.
I hear you. But Scripture says that you love the Lord thy God with your soul, with your heart, and with your mind. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about when I talk about policy is the failed educational system within Chicago, where we have 50 schools that are closed and funding being cut. And we talk about this idea of Jesus, whom I love, but I think that Jesus alone is not going to solve the world's problems. I think there has to be a marrying of the church and also education. And for me, theological education is quite important. But I'll leave that right there.
Can I say
Sure.
this really quickly? I don't necessarily ascribe to the separation of church and state, and maybe what I'm hoping to effectively articulate is that at every step of legislation, from my experience having been involved with politics, all those decisions that have been made that we hear about, there's been at least one pastor, one clergy in the room, each one. And these government officials still look to clergy for the go-ahead, for the green light. Is this okay with you all? And I'm literally perplexed because we have, just like Rahm Emanuel, I can think of many things that this man has sat down with us about, decisions that he's the only one responsible for, but we all were sitting in the room when he said, "What do y'all, is this okay?" And the majority said yes. So as it relates to policy, again, I think that the discontent with the clergy and how, what do we need to focus on as far as policy is that we got to get back to the basics of trying to build our community and loving ourselves and loving the people around us, so that we'll start voting and making decisions more with good conscience, knowing that education should not fail. There is an intentional design to overthrow the Chicago public school system and to privatize education. It's intentional. It had clergy. Some of the stuff that I'm looking at on the news, on the thing, these are meetings I was in. It just blows my mind.
So for our last question,
More to
before we
compromise.
open up for the dialogue with the audience, both of you are pastors. It seemed that both of you are children of the Black church. So the Black church has been a part of the Black protests and resistant movements since the Hearst Harbors throughout the Civil Rights Movement. The Black church is also considered to be a safe haven for those who fight for and seek justice. How should we galvanize and mobilize more Black churches to participate in the struggle for liberation and equity?
Wow, you're asking me questions. I hate being so contradictory. I don't think the Black church is the answer. I don't think the Black church is the answer. I don't think the Black church is the way. I think that's another difficulty for us to wrap our minds around. I think that the Black church has let us down. I think that the Black church has done a lot of oppression. And so I think now you're seeing young people who are now saying, to hell with the church. And so I don't necessarily believe that the church is the way. One of the challenges is I think community outreach is the way. I upset many of my council members as I pastor the first African American UCC church in the Chicago Metropolitan Association, and so I really upset many of our council persons when I said, from here on out, we're not going to have church no more. I said, we're going to get through Easter, we're going to get through Palm Sunday, we're going to do a dynamite Good Friday service with Reverend William Hall. We're going to get through Easter, and then after that, I said, I'm shutting the church down. No more church. And so because most of my membership is middle age, older, they thought that was a travesty. And they said, oh, Danielle, you can't do that. And I said, here's my challenge. Our community outreach is larger than our Sunday worship attendance. So my girls' mentoring program that meets on Saturdays, I can get 100 girls. None of those girls come back to Sunday worship on Sundays. We have a Friday night boys program. We can get about 200 boys from the Woodlawn neighborhood to come out on a Friday night. None of those boys come to church on Sundays. And so I'm more interested in talking about how do we begin to do more community outreach? What does it look like? Instead of the church being the end-all, be-all, what does it look like to do more community outreach? The Christian church is dying. And I know that's something I'm not supposed to say at a seminary with a bunch of people who want to go work for the church. So I'm sorry for the paradox in that. But if you look at church attendance across the board, the church that we know is dying. But what is thriving is an evangelical conservative rhetoric. Those churches are doing phenomenal. Churches that are pushing a conservative evangelical rhetoric are growing by leaps and bounds. But the social justice church that we're used to, that church is dying. And what more people are more so interested in is community outreach. Community outreach has now become the quote-unquote church. And so if you ask me, what can the church do? I'm going to say that the church can be more community outreach oriented. So for example, some things, and I want to talk specifics. I feel like we've been talking airy for the last hour. We'll talk about specifics. One, we've started a Monday through Friday Safe Haven program where persons from our neighborhood schools can come to our church for a couple of hours after school through Safe Haven programming. Two, we have become a meeting space for local CAPS meetings so that our police department can begin to have conversations with our brothers and sisters in the Woodlawn neighborhood. Three, we've really been trying to push more understandings around boys and girls mentorship. And how do you have mentorship of our little baby girls and little baby boys? We're also starting to push more an agenda around African-centered psychology. And so whereas your public schools are unfortunately going downhill, how do we begin to get our African-American baby girls and baby boys in our African-centered schools? Also looking at many of our freedom schools. Also, we're beginning to look at what does it mean to connect the dots between mental illness and social justice. What does it mean to connect the dots between having a therapist, psychologist on hand for mental health counseling? Because we inherently believe that if you don't teach persons how to have mental health and mental stability, then they will be lost. And so I believe it's time out for just doing Bible study. I believe it's time out for just doing Sunday worship. I believe it's time out for just citing cliches and rhetoric. I believe if you really want to talk about what does ministry look like in the 21st century, I think it's radically different than what we are used to. For all intensive purposes, it was black folk who put Rahm Emanuel in office. Now you want to be angry at him? I don't get it. Now you want to be upset with him? It was because of African Americans' lack of love in self that you ran to and put your hope in this Jewish gentleman who really is not concerned with the needs and the issues of African American people to begin with. But because you saw a connection between him and Barack Obama, because of our own lack of love and self-confidence, he was the great Jewish hype for us. And now we're frustrated that now he is doing what he was going to do initially. Now we're frustrated and we're angry about that? I don't know. If we had lack of love to begin with, then maybe we would have voted for Amara Enya. Maybe if we had some sense of confidence and love, we would have elected an African-American candidate for mayor who would have had our interests at heart instead of trying to have meetings with a mayor who is in a Zionist Jewish faith tradition. Zionist Jews are separatists. Zionist Jews don't like black folk. So to sit down and constantly be meeting, asking, would you give us, would you give us, would you give us? Again, for me, the issue becomes, how do we have love for self so that we can empower ourselves to make movements instead of always asking for a place at that same damn table when you can create your own table, becomes the issue for me.
Ms. Baum, I think that I actually agree with the pastor, the doc, a great degree. I'm often saddened sometimes when I wake up, and I know that if I go out talking about I'm Pastor Jedediah, how the response of my peers is going to be. The black church has dropped the ball, and I honestly don't get it. But how do you engage them and get them to mobilize again? I think that the church has to come to self again, and it needs to repent. I think it needs to find where it went wrong, and this is nothing that's not historical. Society has gotten away from the way many times. What I'm more interested in, though, is not trying to convince dead people to act alive. I'm just going where I'm just moving forward and just asking and hoping that God would raise up a remnant, because you can't put, as the Bible would say, new wine in old wineskin. I think that the black church has dropped the ball, but it also has the potential to pick it back up. But the methods is going to have to drastically change. I do agree that it can't be the same Sunday worship, Sunday morning worship, the Wednesday night Bible study. It's Bible study right now, and I was more excited about being here than being in my own church preaching Bible study, engaging the community. But again, I think I said it. I think that that I need the older generation to not look at my generation as so far gone, and just have a moment where they say, "Yeah, I was young too, and I've been there," and help us see how to get to where you got. I wish even today I would, I just had a conversation with a pastor that I respect, and I was talking to him about, man, I need to go back to get my education, but I just don't want to go to seminary because some days I wish I would wake up and believe, I wish my Savior say he's Muslim so I can go join Farrakhan. They ain't doing nothing. So it's just, this is a very tough question for me to answer, because I'm at a place where I'm actually saying, I'm praying the most powerful prayer you can pray, which is, God, I need your help. We need your help. And as far as elections are concerned, I am one of those people who supported Rahm Emanuel. I am one of those people who became an advisor to Rahm Emanuel. I'm also one of the people who, before I made that decision, I asked both candidates that were left to tell us what their plan was for our community, and one didn't have a plan and the other one did. When you vote, you're taking a chance based on what's available to you. And I took a chance based on everything that I knew. But at the end of the day, my hope was he messed up the first time. He's not used to this kind of accountability and authority. But we're going to love ourselves enough to understand that that is just a personality in a seat. If we build community and if we love ourselves, we make them responsive and accountable to what we identify we want to be done in our neighborhood. And again, it only comes from experience. Politicians respond to me because they know I ain't going for nothing else. My trash in back of my house is going to be picked up if everybody else in the wards isn't, because they know if you don't, I'm at your door. And I'll come and put my garbage can in your office. And so the black church was my number one source of life pain. That's where I hurt the most, personally. So how am I going to encourage people to get back active is just simply this. When everybody talk about what the black church is doing, I just try to be at least one that's not. And hopefully people will latch on to that, because when you see real, you respond to real. And a lot of people tend to connect onto it, which is why I believe I started the organization Young Leaders Alliance here, and it was in 7 states in less than a year.
All right. Are there any final words that you both have?
I think we have to continue to have tough conversations. I think I appreciate this conversation, no matter how difficult it is. I think we have to not be afraid to continue to grapple with this issue. I also think we have to, as African Americans, begin to envision doing some things different. I think that we're also at a place where we have to begin to say, as painful and as difficult as it is, how do we find our own voice without repeating the same voices from the past? One of the things I love about family systems theory, I'm a huge family systems theory proponent, is that in some sense, family systems theory asks you to find your own voice. Find, even though you have these messages from mama, from daddy, from grandma, from grandpa, the family systems theory says at some point you are going to have to ask the question, who are you? Right? I'm going to state my one Bible passage. Even Jesus asked people, who do you say that I am? And so in some sense, I think that we have to begin to really wrestle with our identity. Who are we, and what are we going to be? What are we going to do? What is it? What is it that God is calling us to be and do? And I think that has to be radically different, right? When I'm traveling downtown and I see the biggest growing church is John Hannah meeting at the UIC Pavilion, and folks flocking to go to John Hannah's church, or people flocking to go to some of these large mega churches that have not one social justice bone in their body. Or when I see folks who are involved in this social justice movement, but only want to do it so that they can be in front of a camera and have their name known, I am concerned, right? I even said the way we market is different. When I was growing up, whenever you put out a flyer, you put out a flyer with the building of the church. Now I am perplexed because I have colleagues who market their face on the flyer. It's not even about the movement. It's not even about the church. It's about their face. I just saw a young lady, and I'm going to try to not say her name because I know we live streaming. I just saw a young lady who was put out a flyer on social media about particular preaching engagements. Had nothing to do with the church, had nothing to do with the movement. It was literally a picture of her face and a bunch of dates when she's preaching in the cities that she's in. And so I become concerned. I become concerned around when we talk about the future in this movement. I begin to ask the question, what is our intent? Are we doing this to just be in the limelight? Are we doing this just so that we could say da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? Or are we doing this because it is something deeper in us? Because the growing churches are not the social justice churches. They are the evangelical conservative churches.
Thank you. Any last words?
So I'll make it brief and just say that we have over 20,000 homeless young people in our city. We have, there is expected to be over 700 dead bodies from gun violence this year alone. We have a very, very, very high unemployment rate in our community that I can't put the number on. I can't think of the number right now. We have a governor and a mayor who is not listening to nobody. We have a growing disconnect intergenerationally. We have a lot of confusion about what the role of the church is. What I'm saying is, we are in an amazing place. Because when things get this bad, history tends to raise up some individuals who say enough is enough. And whatever our positioning and our placement is, that person might be in this room today. And I'm just hoping that we stop convincing ourselves out of being the solution we need. It doesn't matter how our perspectives are different. At the end of the day, we all got the same goal. And we need each other. I'm not worried about what everybody else is doing and not doing. Just do something. Because no matter what the numbers say, I didn't become the number I was supposed to be because I saw an option out of it. And that may not be in a seminary, it may not be on the panel, it may not be in the news, but we can be some of the most decent people on our jobs. And you might change the whole, I see it every day, you might change the entire company. So the last thing I want to say is, oftentimes, I'll just use it as an analogy, and I just told you, I don't get to use the Bible so much, so I just put the Bible in all my statements today. When I think about the woman at the well, when I think about the man at the pool of Bethesda, when I think about what baptism signifies, we got a lot of problems. But we need to do one goal, and this is just an analogy. We got to get the people to the water. Get them to the solution. And don't let the headlines tell us what's going on, because they be lying. I even seen them I've made a statement, they'll take one little bitty piece of what I said and it'll be something completely different. And I be called like, y'all, did y'all really do that? You will have what you establish. And for the room, because of where I'm at, I'm going to say this. I didn't get the education that you got. Even as the doctor and the pastor articulated, I didn't feel any other way than just saying I praise God for brilliance and articulated minds. But we need to bridge these gaps, and these conversations need to pull them in too. Because if we do it, I'm sorry, y'all, I'm not trying to ramble. If we do it, if we have the tough conversations, so for example, and I'll just say this to be practical, applicable. I told my church when the summer hit, get ready, because I'm getting ready to make everybody uncomfortable. And if that means I lose my church, it's okay. But it's time for the church to go in the closet. I hope you caught it. We're going in the closet. We about to go and deal with. It's time for the church to go in the closet. We telling people come out, it's time to go in. We're talking about the dysfunction of family. It's time for us to start addressing what's really going on in our homes. It's time for us to start addressing how our kids feel while we shouting and they feeling miserable. We talking about all this life and they feel like they want to die. We need to go and hit these situations head on. And everybody needs to humble themselves, take all your titles away, take all your presence away, take all your whatever you got, and let's be human again. If we can do that approach, I believe that we'll be the village that we need to be. And I hope I made sense to y'all in the simple saying, y'all, let's change this, because we ain't got to live like this. Let's change our minds.
All right. Let us thank our panelists, the Reverend Dr. Danielle Buhuro and the Reverend Jedediah Brown. So we have time for 3 questions. Oh, okay. 2 questions then.
Reverend Brown, you had talked about leadership being co-opted by resources, and now that we're looking at a new movement or a movement called Black Lives Matter, should we be concerned about outside entities that might co-opt the Black Lives Matters with resources?
It's already happened. It's not something to be worried about. It's something to understand. It is a reality. And it is again another challenge, something that I try to think about on a consistent basis. Even with me, when it comes to organizing, and you need resources. Sometimes the individuals that give you the resources, they want to change your message. They want to tailor it to what they want, and they don't allow you to have the freedom or the liberation at times. So people who are well-funded and well-positioned, sometimes you probably want to do the research and check who pushing them, because it is co-opted already.
Oh, yeah, excuse me, I'm getting over a little cold here. But I was listening to the discussion about the role of the black church, and I noticed how you said we should not rely on the church per se, but on community outreach. And I know how you said the black church needs to step it up, if you will, as they have dropped the ball. I don't necessarily have a question, but I think what the issue is in our generation today is that the church has separated the lifestyle from the belief. You know, what the church teaches today is all about belief. Just believe in God, believe in Jesus. That's all that matters. You know, it's all about tradition. It's all about just walking in, you know, doing these, you know, so-called worships that don't really bring much about anything, where the key is lifestyle. You know, it's constantly repeated throughout the Bible. Change your heart, change your lives. You lead by your lifestyle. And more importantly, I think the earliest Christians in the first century, they essentially were community outreach. They were a small grassroots movement who went out and led to example by speaking out against principalities that held people down in the areas. So I think in discussing what the black church should do, I think we should focus on actually living the lifestyle and walking the lifestyle versus just, you know, having a belief and not actually living it, because then that kind of shows that your faith really isn't there.
Right. So one of the things that we're doing at Lincoln, because I know we got to wrap up, is we're not having a Palm Sunday service. I'm encouraging everyone to go online to the Community Renewal Society. Community Renewal Society is doing a Occupy Palm Sunday movement, where the Community Renewal Society is asking churches to do a 1-hour Palm Sunday service from 11 o'clock to 12 o'clock, and then leave your place of worship, your building, and go to your nearest police district and ask that your local police department sign the Fair Cops Initiative. And so it's a huge movement. I encourage all of you all to go online and check it out. It's called the Occupy Palm Sunday movement. I think that's one example. I'm also interested in doing church different and anew, as you said. So I'm excited about after we do this whole Occupy Palm Sunday movement at Lincoln, we're doing a 7 last word service through the lens of Black Lives Matter. And so I've asked 7 preachers to come out and not talk about the 7 last sayings of Jesus through an evangelical conservative perspective. But if Jesus was a black man or a little black girl who had died as a result of police brutality, what would that voice then be? And so I think it's, again, doing ministry radically different, where the focus, again, is on community outreach. I also think there has to be some greater, deeper conversations more than just race. I think there has to be some conversations around sexism. I think there has to be some conversations around homophobia. I think there has to be some conversations around classism. I think sometimes we get stuck on the whole race piece, the whole race card, and I think we need to begin to shift and have some deeper conversations.
Thank you.
Then, if I may, just say this 2 seconds. I think you're absolutely correct, and I agree with what you're saying. We spend more time in church now talking about what people are doing in their house, and who hating on you, and what you about to get. And we have a bunch of people who have no idea of the things that's affecting their everyday quality of life. And we've sensationalized a lot of stuff. It's a lot of emotionalism. People don't even know what they believe, but they believe they got haters, and you living paycheck to paycheck. Really? Nobody's hating on you. So I think that we do have to change the context and get back to what, even that, again, that's why I say it's important to know where you came from so you know where you're going. What was the foundation of church? What was it even designed for? What was it historically positioned to do? And we've gotten so far from that. Again, I think we need to start appreciating history and be educated and know where we came from. And that's something that I plan on doing with my particular church, is peeling back from all the emotional stuff and say, hey, y'all, let's get some professors. Imagine a professor coming to church. We ain't preaching today. We're gonna listen to a lecture. And we're gonna give to the professor. You know what I'm saying? So it's a different positioning and a different place, and then also a call to action. I think that church should also challenge you. When you leave church, you shouldn't just feel an emotional high, but you should feel pressed and challenged to affect change when you leave there. And that's what I want to get our churches to be in again.
All right, thank you so very much for coming out. And
Pastor Hall, good seeing you.
take all the food home. Yes. It's plenty.
Amen.
Oh, yes, thank you. Reverend Goods, thank you so much for making this happen. And thank my colleague and sister Ace friend, Minister Melanie Jones, and certainly to our black faculty, a few of them who are here, Dr. Julia Speller and Dr. Joanne Marie Terrell. All right, that's all. Thank you.